Okay, and Chris Jones is here with me today. And so Chris, thanks for coming and talking to me. Could you,
Welcome.
Yeah, could you just briefly tell people a little bit about your background and what your journey was to becoming a lecturer in TESOL and applied linguistics?
Okay. Yeah, so I started off as a English language teacher, and that was in 1993, and I worked,
Wow.
that was my full-time job I worked in Japan, and I worked in Thailand, and I also taught English in the UK. Kind of during that time, at later, I suppose slightly later stages, I was involved in teacher training as well. So I trained some people on the Distance Delta program, and I did some in-service, teaching for practicing language teachers, for example, in Japan, in Thailand, that kind of thing. Then I came back to the UK in 2006 and got a job as a lecturer in a university here, and that was in TESOL, Applied Linguistics. And I ran a program which was an undergraduate TESOL and Modern Languages program. I was involved in the TESOL side of it. So students did half TESOL, and they studied a modern language such as French, etc. And also part of that program was also involved teacher training, because the students had to do lots of teaching practice, etc., as part of the course, and the Trinity Cert TESOL was also part of the course, so it's kind of connected to that. I wasn't a full-time English language teacher by that stage, but I did still do some language teaching. Then in 2016, I moved to University of Liverpool, where I am now, in the Department of English. And I basically work on our MA TESOL and MA Applied Linguistics programs. And I still do a bit of English language teaching on the side in my own time, not at the university, but kind of when I can, really. Yeah. So in terms of research, my main research interest is I'm interested in spoken language. So that means I'm interested in analyzing spoken language by looking at particularly spoken corpora, but I'm also interested in how elements of spoken language are learnt. So that really takes me into instructed second language acquisition type of studies that I've done. So those are the kind of two main strands. And there's lots of analysis of spoken language, but I'm also interested in seeing how that actually might work in terms of teaching and learning.
Okay, yeah.
Yep, so that's it, I think.
Yeah, I think we'll come to some of that later on. But
okay.
So just to start off then, you are obviously someone who is or has a lot of experience teaching, and you said you still teach now, but you're also an ivory tower academic, as some people might say. And one of the areas that really interests me is this kind of gap or perceived gap between teaching and research. So I guess the question I'd be interested in particularly hearing your answer to is, can research inform teaching, or is it, as some people say, just kind of best to ignore research altogether?
Well, obviously, you know what I'm going to say. Of course, it can inform teaching. I am biased here. I'm lucky enough in my job to get to do research. I can totally appreciate that it's very difficult for teachers themselves to have the time to research. Can research help teachers? Yes, obviously. Most teachers English language teachers will make use of a dictionary at some point. And that's based on research. It's based on corpus linguistics research. And very useful they are too. I think most teachers would agree with that. In terms of other studies, yes, they can certainly benefit from, again, I'm biased, but the work in corpus linguistics has told us an awful lot about what people say when they have conversations, how they have conversations, what kind of language they typically use, how that differs from the kind of language which often appears in textbooks. So maybe that all seems a little bit obvious now, but certainly when I started teaching, that wasn't on the radar. You know, you were given a dialogue from a textbook. You thought in your head, this is a slightly strange dialogue, but you kind of proceeded with it because we didn't have the benefit of corpora, and I didn't know anything about corpus linguistics when I started teaching. So those things can be beneficial. Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, no, just on that point, while I've got you on that point, I was going to talk about this later, but since you've brought it up, so one of the kind of fiercest critics of research in teaching is Alan Maley, who has kind of said, you know,
yeah,
you don't need it at all, it doesn't really help. But even he concedes that corpus research is useful, and he kind of puts it in a separate category, not actually pedagogical research. It's something different. So that kind of, it's a bit of a loophole, it seems to me, but there we go. But yeah, I think the first paper of yours I ever read was the paper on conditionals.
Yeah, okay.
And so I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and about that specific example of how, because there's lots of studies like this that look at corpus informing actual language teaching and materials work. But this one, I think, is a really nice example because everybody knows from textbooks the 4 conditionals. And your research, and actually research prior to your research, has kind of debunked that to some extent. And I would say, you know, so could you talk a little bit about that? And also another question, a bit more of a pointed question perhaps, do you think that research like this will actually have an effect on what publishers put in their books?
Okay, that's a big question. Yeah, just before I go into that, I should also add, I didn't mention, but I think also teachers can definitely learn from research in second language acquisition, instructed second language acquisition. You know, it may not always be accessible to all teachers, but I think a lot can be learned from that, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, the conditionals article. So we wanted to look at an area there where we felt the way things were described very often in particularly in textbooks and classroom materials didn't really reflect usage. So we looked at a corpus and we looked for examples of the conditional patterns that were in there. And what we found were the traditional kind of 0, 1, 2, 3. There were examples of them, but there are many other patterns there in existence. So things don't fit into those slots necessarily. And also the other thing was that by far the majority of the examples are real uses of conditionals. You know, that's the majority by far. But we felt that that was not really represented in a lot of materials. There's a lot of emphasis on, you know, unreal conditionals. What would you do if you won the lottery type of thing? All of those things. A classic, yes. To which the student says, I don't do the lottery. Yeah. Or what's the lottery? That's another one I've heard. So we feel that those were kind of overrepresented. Now, there may be reasons for that, but it seemed to fly in the face of the actual evidence. So that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to show that, look, this is what's actually used. And as you said, there were people who'd looked at this before. There was a guy called Moore in the 80s who looked at it without the benefit of a corpus.
Wow.
The study that he did required him to watch, I think he said, and it might have been 100 or anyway, a large number of hours of television writing down the examples that he heard, which is fantastic. And it's a very interesting piece. And he talks about it. He talked about then the idea that the division wasn't really accurate and we should talk about real uses and unreal uses. So that's really what we wanted to say. The second part of the question was, I think, will that change anything?
Yeah, the reason I ask this, I mean, you've kind of, you used is it Ball? You used the same
Maule,
yeah.
M-A-U-L-E. Yeah, Maule.
You used the same division, I think. You gave examples of unreal and present and unreal past. And
yeah, that's right.
yeah. And I guess the reason I'm asking this is because a similar kind of, I mean, this was an ELTJ article. Your article is an ELTJ. There's an article by Paran, I think, in 1990, kind of decrying reading skills teaching and saying, you know, we've been doing it wrong for 10 years and sure it's going to change anytime now. And when I teach on CELTA courses and look at textbooks, it's pretty much the same as it was 30 years ago. So
yeah,
do you get a sense that conditional teaching has changed since then or is changing?
yeah, I think there's a really interesting PhD by a guy called Graham Burton, who which I was very lucky enough to be able to examine. Well, it was a privilege to examine. Very, very good PhD, very good piece of research. And that's on he calls it the canon of pedagogical grammar, which I think is a very nice word. And he talks about the PhD is kind of how that's developed, where it's come from. And I think it's available, the PhD, open access. Anyway, he looks at certain items like conditionals, relative clauses, all the things that we all could kind of identify as being part of this pedagogical grammar, and looks at where it's come from, and then looks at how accurate it is or isn't. And the kind of conclusion was that it's very established. It's very hard to change in many ways, it seems. So I'm not a publisher, but I know Graham worked in publishing. I think that probably if somebody went to a publisher and tried to suggest something which was radically different to what is already there, they might have difficulty getting it published. I'm not an expert on that, but that's my suspicion. So will it change in terms of that? I think it might do, but it might be very, very slow. Could this kind of thing, corpus linguistics research, change teachers' individual practices? Yes, I think potentially. At least it might make them think about language in a way which is beyond, it might make them think about language in a way which is beyond what's kind of presented to them, and perhaps ring a bell with teachers who are kind of asking those questions themselves already,
Yeah, they've got a bit
if that
sick
makes sense.
Yes, yeah, they're kind of thinking like the 10th year teaching the third conditional, and they're thinking, I'm not sure I ever say this.
Yes, that's exactly what I mean. Is this example seems very odd and unnatural. Would I say this? Probably not.
Yeah, there is. I was talking to a colleague today actually about this, that we were talking about thesis statements and teaching thesis statements and how kind of hung up as EAP teachers we've become, and whole lessons around thesis statements. And
yeah,
I think there's a kind of teachability trap, and I think this goes for skimming and scanning and other things.
Yeah.
And especially I think with exponents, when you have a speaking lesson and you have like,
yes,
I call it, I did a talk on this actually called smorgasbording, where people will present a range of exponents and say, take your pick. You can say it causes, it's affected by, it's a consequence of, and these are all equal, and you can swap one in for the other. And the students think that they're getting a lot of stuff, and you feel like you're teaching, but actually like it's more helping you, because you're doing something which is, I would say, inauthentic in a sense, with the conditional certainly, and possibly with the thesis statements. You're doing something that's kind of inauthentic, but it fits into a lesson.
Yeah, I think there is obviously there are probably certain things in the canon, if you like, and he looks at the canon of grammar particularly, but there is probably also a canon of lexis to some degree as well, and maybe there's also a canon of functional exponents to a certain degree. I don't know, but I think there is an element of things are teachable. So you mentioned about essay writing. One thing that students definitely get taught, because I teach students who've done pre-sessional courses, and there's not necessarily anything wrong with this, but they definitely get taught things such as, however, as a result, all of those items, moreover, all of those. And why is that? Well, one reason is that they are teachable.
Yeah.
And it's not an entirely, I'm not trying to criticize people who teach those things, because obviously there is a need for students to have them. The question is whether, EAP teaching, which you're talking about there, needs to go beyond that, or not, or needs to rethink that. That's a kind of bigger question. But yeah, I think certain things are definitely taught because they are teachable. Yes.
There's an article, also ELTJ, I think it's Crew 1996 possibly, which is called The Illogic of Logical Connectives. And he actually, he's teaching in Hong Kong, and he kind of does a study on, because he's kind of noticed the fact that students will just use these connecting words as kind of decoration in their essays almost. And he kind of says that quite often it makes it harder to understand. And I've noticed the same thing that you mentioned, that almost every sentence there will be an in addition, a moreover. And I say, where did these come from? And, they say, oh, my teacher in China or whatever, told me that I'll get a higher score on IELTS if I, and it's actually true, because I used to be an IELTS examiner, and band 6 says something like, the student or the test taker can use connective terms, but perhaps mechanically or not very well. That's a band 6, I think.
Wow.
So there's a logic to it almost. It's yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, and of course, some learners will need to use those to it's not that they didn't come into the kind of curriculum, if you like, because without any reason,
right,
not just because they're teachable, but the question is, are there other things which are also more useful, or are they over taught, and all of those things?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Let's move on, and I want to talk to you a little bit about practice.
Okay. Yeah.
Because you have literally written a book on practice. Here it is.
Yeah. Well, I edited it, to be fair. I didn't write the whole thing, but colleagues contributed chapters. Yeah.
Yeah. You can kind of claim that I've written the book on it, as it were. So
yes.
Practice is I've written a blog post on this, and I came across De Keyser, and De Keyser writes the foreword for.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he says the same thing in this book that he does in his previous one, which is that, and I think you mentioned this as well, that it's a chronically kind of under-researched part of ELT, which is really strange, because it's such a huge part of a teacher's job. If you've done any kind of training, you'll know that practice, or any kind of teaching for that matter, that practice is kind of, that's where it's at.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess one question then is, why, as it's kind of such an important part of teaching, such a main part of teaching, why is it so kind of ignored, I suppose perhaps the word is, by research? Is it I've got kind of two suggestions here. Is it that it's such an amorphous term?
Yeah.
Kind of, you've got to break it down in order to actually be able to research it, and people are actually researching those things? Or is it perhaps, and I think maybe De Keyser has hinted at this, that there's some kind of unpleasant or unsavory connotation attached to the notion of practice?
I think probably there are, both of those things are true to some degree. I think it covers a lot of different areas, potentially, and maybe people are looking at particular aspects of, for example, in instructed second language acquisition, they might be looking at a very particular aspect of something, and that may not be described as practice, but it may be in some senses a form of practice. The second point about it being negatively associated with something, yeah, I think there is an element there where practice is sometimes viewed as something connected to drilling, for example, which is then associated negatively with behaviorist theories of language learning, etc. So there is an element of that, I think. Yeah. I would say, yeah, broadly speaking, he's probably right on both fronts there.
Right. And so you've edited this book on practice.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Can you say a little? I mean, you're a big fan of practice. So I guess, what is it, and how can it help? It's a bit of a big question. Sorry about that. Yeah.
That's okay.
How is practice defined, and is it useful? I mean, does research suggest that practice is useful, or are we better off just letting students kind of acquire language through input naturally in a kind of Krashen-esque way?
Well, that's a big question. Yeah, it is a big question. I think, well, the way we defined it in the book was we took Decase's definition, which was specific activities. I'm just reading it, but specific activities in the second language engaged in deliberately with the goal of developing knowledge of or skills in the L2. So a very quite a long definition.
Yeah.
What do we mean by that? We wanted in this book to try to look at it, try to not narrow it down to just being an activity such as a drill. What does it mean, engaged in deliberately with the goal of developing knowledge of or skills in the L2? Well, it could mean things that we associate with practice in the classroom, drilling, role plays, that kind of thing. Those could be example activities which will be familiar to teachers, particularly from a kind of more communicative tradition, but probably to many teachers these days. But also practice takes place in study abroad situations, when it's engaged in deliberately with the goal of developing knowledge of or skills in the L2. So we know when people go on study abroad periods, they might personally seek particular deliberate ways to practice, of course, but they can also be given particular ways to practice. Maybe I'll come on to that with the kind of some of the results. The third thing that we wanted to say was that practice probably often gets associated, as I said, with the classroom and with a particular type of activity such as drilling. But of course, many learners will also be practicing in online environments now, all kinds of online environments. So that might be by using apps which we would associate with, repetition, drilling, that kind of practice. So things like Duolingo, I know, are very popular. But also they may use other online mediums such as social media deliberately to practice their knowledge of or skills in the L2, not just to interact. Of course, there will be people who will just be doing it to interact, but there is some I think evidence that learners will do that, and it's kind of logical if you think about it. So yeah, it can happen in different environments. That's the first thing. What was the second part of the question? What did we find out?
Yes, yeah. What was it? I think that was it. Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a few different things.
Yes. Can practice help? Can it help with language acquisition?
Well, yes, we found evidence that practice definitely can help. it can help with students going on study abroad is one example, and particularly with pragmatic uses of language. So, different speech acts, which it seems are quite resistant to acquisition, or at least will take a lot longer. Most people's study abroad period is going to be relatively short, and they may not have the time to acquire certain pragmatic uses of language. So 2 studies in the book found that very specific instruction and practice activities can at least speed that process up.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily picked up by just being in the study abroad environment.
Right. So it's a case of not either or, but both coming together.
Yeah. So it's not enough for probably a lot of learners to just be in the study abroad environment.
Right.
But if they're given very specific, instruction and practice on aspects of, pragmatic language use. So one of the studies in the book by my colleague, Nicola Helenko, looked at apologies and instruction and practice of apologies, and she found there was a significant effect for instruction, and obviously practice was part of the instruction in that with study abroad students in the UK. So that's one aspect. Can it work in other ways? Yes, there's another study in the book on learning of idioms.
Yeah.
And that study looked at whether when students learn are taught idioms, these were Spanish L2 learners, whether they can, if you like, pick up any grammar from that for free. And also that in that study, the students were not asked to produce the idioms at all. So that's another kind of distinction we make. There's receptive practice where, and the reason we make this distinction is that we think that often people associate with practice with output only.
Right, I was going to talk about that. That was one of the most kind of eye-opening things about the book, because I remember thinking to myself like, oh God, yeah, you can practice input as well, of course.
Yeah. So practicing from the input. Well, total physical response is a kind of practice from the input, which is used a lot with learners, younger learners, excuse me. Anyway, so yeah, the study on Spanish learning of Spanish idioms found that there were 2 groups. They both were taught these idioms. They didn't actually have to produce them, but then they checked whether there was all of the idioms had a particular grammatical form in them, and they checked via a couple of different tests whether students noticed that particular grammatical form, even though they'd not been actually specifically taught it or not. And the results are show that to a limited extent that was certainly possible in this case. So maybe it shows that one, you can practice doesn't need to involve production. Right. Second, that practicing with one particular form, this is a type of formulaic sequence, can result in incidental grammar learning, if you like. So that's a couple of things.
Yeah, no, I thought that was really I read that particular paper, and I thought that was really an interesting finding. I think they found in some the verb forms they were looking at, in some cases they were the students improved on using them, but in other cases of the same verb form they didn't improve.
Yeah, there were different functions of the same verb form. Yeah, but
it is kind of fascinating to think about the fact. I don't know, maybe this is just fascinating for me, but the fact that we're sitting here kind of saying that actually, I mean, you talked about apologies, but we're kind of saying, which will sound crazy to a new teacher, that if you want someone to get better at something, teaching them how to do it is a good way of kind of doing it, practicing the skill is, but I mean, we without knowing the history of TEFL research and knowing why that statement is such a kind of almost controversial one to make, I mean, it is kind of interesting, isn't it, that you actually, yeah, because in other fields I find, like if you went for piano lessons or whatever, but then there is the argument about whether language is different from those kinds of skills. So
yeah, and I mean, I think, yeah, what we found in those kind of studies that I mentioned was that the instruction practice was part of the instruction, obviously. It did seem to speed it up. It doesn't guarantee that students will learn this stuff. We know this, that what you teach, what you practice is not necessarily going to be acquired, obviously not. And I think you mentioned Krashen earlier. I'm not going to go into a kind of big debate on that, but I think
very wise.
There's absolutely, of course, that there will be a role for learners picking up things from input of all kinds. Of course, input is massively important to them. I don't think many people would possibly argue with that.
No.
It's the big question comes down to whether that's going to be enough for most learners, and that's the debate that's there to be had. Yeah, obviously we're suggesting in this book that we think instruction can help and practice can help. Yeah.
So you mentioned Duolingo earlier, and those kind of I don't know if this is something that you looked at or not, but mechanical practice and drill and kill kind of stuff. I mean, the name drill and kill, for example, gets quite a bad rap. I don't know. I haven't seen if you've researched this or looked into it, but do you know anything about whether it actually is effective or not to do kind of?
I don't know about that. We didn't research that app particularly or similar apps like it. But one thing that we did find is that there's another study which was done with L2 German learners in the UK in a secondary environment. It's a smaller scale study, but a very, very interesting one in the book. And that the finding from that was that that made use of online text chat, something which obviously is very accessible to everybody now. And that found that there were very positive results for the use of text chat as a type of practice with those learners. In this case in L2 German. So yeah, online environments as a sort of site for practice, we felt shouldn't really be ignored. And I think a few years ago, there's an academic called Hugh Jarvis who wrote about the idea that we should move away from computer-assisted language learning to mobile-assisted language use. And I think that's a pretty good description. And probably we should see learners as mobile-assisted language users.
Right.
Therefore, the practice that we give them should kind of take account of that, really.
Yeah. I wonder if the study that you mentioned was, I don't know which particular one, but I wonder if it's because there was was there I don't know if you know whether there was a meaning focus. Were they doing the text chatting with people who were their peers?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, there was. It was Mariah Michelle, and she's a colleague who used to work at the University of Lancaster, and is still an academic. The students were given tasks, and the tasks were meaningful, but also they were given some suggestions to use particular language that they'd been taught as well. Yeah, so it wasn't just random kind of text chatting. No, it was deliberate, systematic practice. That was the idea.
Right. Yeah, but presumably with some kind of, they're actually talking to a person, not just doing something.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they were talking to other German users. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can imagine that would be quite, you'd have to kind of think about that more carefully than doing a kind of, I mean, I've used Duolingo and it's not very deep, I guess is the way I would summarize it. It's gamified and just translation. I mean, I'm not saying it's terrible, but it's, I don't know how effective it is. So the next thing I kind of thought we could talk a little bit about is lexical chunks.
Okay.
You have written quite a lot about lexical chunks.
Yeah.
And it's kind of come to my attention with some reading I've been doing and looking at what is effective and what isn't effective in the classroom, and what kind of, what solid kind of, what can we put our hand on and say that will definitely be effective. And if you look at the lists from people like Ellis, he has a list of kind of, I think 10 or 12, it changes, and Long has his 10 things that are very important, and research definitely backs up. Both of those lists, I think, contain the notion that language should be taught in chunks, which was kind of one of the most surprising, I guess, for me, results, and one of the most kind of, almost, you could put it straight into the classroom kind of results. So how, I guess the question I'd like to ask you is, how can chunks help with learning?
Oh, another big question. Well, I think they.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, no, it's okay. I think there is a lot of good evidence that formula, they're called different things, aren't they? Chunks, formulaic sequences, etc. But anyway, let's use the word chunks. They make up a big part of what language users use when they use language, and corpus evidence has shown that for quite a long time. So, you know, if we go back to Sinclair talked about the open choice principle versus the idiom principle. Idiom principle, the idea is that a lot of language is almost is produced, is how shall I put it, extracted from the mind, if you like, as we would an idiom, as a whole piece. So a lot of languages like that, and we then make use of the open choice principle, where we use the grammar kind of, you know, more creatively, if you like. But we use the open choice principle a lot less than we might think. So I think Sinclair said that in 1991. So it's quite a long time ago now. So there is good evidence, I think, that people do use lexical chunks, and there's increasing evidence that they're used, of course, across different languages, different second languages. The question was, how can they help?
I was just going to say on that point, before you get to that, I don't know if you said you lived in Japan before, and I'm currently living in Japan. I don't know if you studied Japanese or not, but
yeah, I did. Yeah.
As a kind of learner of Japanese, I became aware, I think, as I got better, that I could physically kind of notice myself cobbling together prefabricated bits of the language as I got more and more advanced. So this finding is really kind of intuitive in a way. And I've also seen research, I think, I can't remember who it was, but on speaking tests, which said they looked at the students, and there might be someone writing in a similar vein, but they looked at students who scored, who did well in speaking tests, and they found that there was a higher incidence of what you could call prefabricated or chunks in the people who were perceived to be better at, you know, speaking the language.
So I mean, it's I don't remember in my Japanese lessons being particularly taught many collocations or any other type of chunk, but certainly that they were things that I picked up myself over time. How can they help? Well, I think they can definitely help with fluency, because if if learners can retrieve them as they would retrieve a single item,
Right.
then they can say more, they can say it more quickly, probably, certainly over time, and they are able to, string more together, basically. I think it probably also helps with understanding as well,
Right. Right.
So I think you can, if you're learning to, if you can recognize chunks, it's likely to be easier than trying to recognize just a single word and then piecing the message together, by which time the moment has gone.
You can almost,
So I think,
I was going to say, you
yeah,
can
go
almost
on.
when you're listening, you can almost you become slightly telepathic if you're familiar with chunks, because you know what's coming, what's coming next.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I think they definitely can help learners. There's no doubt about that. The question then becomes, which ones do you teach? Because obviously you can't teach all of them. That would be impossible, and learners can't possibly learn all of them, as we know. So that's a tricky question, which is not necessarily answerable easily. Certainly teachers can use corpus evidence to inform what they're doing, but also they're going to use the context that they're in to inform what they're doing and what their particular group of learners will need. And that seems to be the sensible way to do it. Something we found from when we looked at what chunks learners use, we looked at, in another publication, we looked at what successful learners use in English language speaking tests.
Oh,
so
right.
we made a corpus of B1, B2, C1 learners, and they were only learners who'd passed the test, so they were successful. It wasn't an established mainstream test, if you like, but it was a very typical interview, 3-part interview, which was paired and interactive. So it was reasonably representative of a communicative speaking test. What we found from that was that the chunks that speakers used in that data, at least, didn't massively change as levels increased.
Oh.
But what happens is they use similar chunks with a wider variety of functions. So if they're using at a lower level, they're using something like I think, or I think it's, or whatever, different constructions around think, which obviously is going to be very common in a kind of speaking test. They might use that at the beginning to give their opinion. Later, they might use it to give their opinion, but also to buy themselves time, or also sometimes to hedge what they're saying, etc. So perhaps, certainly from that learner data, we found that the chunks that people use didn't massively change as levels increased, but like I said, the functions did expand, definitely.
Interesting. So just what you were saying earlier about kind of people being able to string together or chunks. Because in the previous interview, I was talking to Carol Letherby, and she's a big kind of proponent of cognitive load theory, and it really does kind of match up with that theory very well, because if something is stored, this kind of notion of 5 items in the working memory, if you're trying to get to a sentence with 5 words, that's going to be much more it's going to be much more of a load on your working memory than if you've stored things as, like, I don't know why you said
Yeah, and I think also that intuitively, certainly something that perhaps one reason I got interested in this kind of thing was, as a teacher, you would come across cases of students who'd been taught grammatical forms such as present perfect continuous, and didn't make use of them for a very long time. But they could all say, how long have you been studying English? Why? Because probably they've just learned that as a chunk,
Yeah.
a chunk which has a very clear function, which gets repeated endlessly in English language classes and becomes very familiar very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So that says to me that there is a there is certainly they certainly should have a role in second language teaching for sure.
It's a beautiful segue to my next question,
Okay.
which is about the notion of acquisition and chunks. So you've just mentioned a brilliant example there of kind of the order of, I mean, this is a big debate in grammar teaching, the order and sequences of acquisition.
Yeah.
And they, there's the sequences, the morpheme studies, I think, come under a bit more criticism these days, but the sequences of acquisition, the acquisition of, I think, question forms, relative clauses, and word order and things like that, mostly Pieneman, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. This stuff is pretty.
Yeah, not sure.
This stuff is pretty robust. It seems at the moment, anyway. And yet, it seems like, and you've just given an example of this, that chunks, in a sense, can override these things. So you can have a student who cannot produce question forms in the correct, kind of question word followed by auxiliary or whatever. But they can say things like, where do you live? Because they have been they've memorized this piece of language, this chunk of language.
Yes.
But then I guess, I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, hopefully not, but the debate seems to be, though, in terms of grammar teaching and chunks, the debate seems to be about whether or not these chunks will have some role in acquisition at some point. And my understanding is, and this could be completely wrong, so please correct me if I am completely wrong, that there is evidence that for L1 learners, there is a process of learning chunks and then breaking them down into smaller parts to acquire the grammar. But it seems, my understanding is, it seems less clear as to whether this happens for L2 learners or not. And I wonder if you could say anything about that.
Yeah, so there are a couple of studies on this that I had a look at, which were, they're quite old now. They're from 1998 and 1999, so I can provide the reference afterwards. They're from Miles, Mitchell, and Hooper, and they looked at L2 French, and it was a longitudinal study, and they found that students could over time start to use the chunks that they learned, break them down, if you like, into their constituent parts and use them creatively. So there is some evidence there. I haven't come across other ones. I mean, I haven't looked at all of the studies. There may be others, but I haven't come across ones. I did ask this because I knew you were going to ask this question. I did ask a couple of colleagues. Other people don't seem to have come across them either.
Okay.
Whether people have done that. Now, I think one of the reasons for that must be that in order to study this, you have to do a longitudinal study.
Right.
And track learners for perhaps a year or 6 months or whatever. And practically speaking, that's often very, very difficult to do with a large enough sample. So I think there is evidence that can happen. I think there's perhaps also a question whether it always matters as well. Does it matter that a learner will break something down into its constituent parts when they've learned it as a chunk? So I was thinking of myself of this when I learned in Japanese, onegai shimasu. I didn't think of that for a very, very long time as having shimasu on the end of it. I didn't think of the constituent parts. I just thought of that as a phrase because I heard it so many times, and that's how I learned it. I didn't need to. And another one was we were taught the verb in a class early on, for switch off, which is, as you know, keshimasu. And we were being taught this verb, and my fellow student and I couldn't recognize this verb. We didn't know where it came from, we didn't know what it meant. And then the teacher said to us, oh, it's keshite. And both of us knew it immediately. Why did we know it? Because we'd heard many times from friends, partners, etc., you know, turn off the TV, telebi keshite, or whatever. So we'd learned it almost as if it was a chunk. But it, in a sense, it didn't matter, because we knew what it meant, we knew how it functioned, and when it was pointed out, okay, yeah, we could break it down, but I'm not sure that I'm not entirely sure it always matters. That's what I would say.
Yeah, yeah. I guess it's some debate about whether or not it can help speed up the acquisition process or something like that, but I think that's a bit beyond my pay grade.
Yeah, you mean speed up the acquisition process of grammar?
Yes.
Or yeah, I mean, I can't see that it would possibly harm students to, you know, if they're learning chunks such as, you know, I know what you mean, or I think, they're also perhaps implicitly learning something about present simple, you know.
It does give us an interesting insight, though, into, I guess, the human mind, that someone will say. I mean, I had a student in the summer who, I don't think a single question form was correct, but yeah, those pre-memorized ones were. They broke the rules, but every other question form that was spontaneously came up with in class was almost guaranteed to be, you know, not standard.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I don't think that anybody who suggests that teaching lexical chunks are important in English as a second language teaching, you know, devalues or thinks that there's no role for grammar.
Sure.
Because you know, clearly there is a role for grammar, and it has an important role.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
No problem.
We've been kind of corresponding, I suppose, on Twitter for 5 years-ish.
Yeah, on and off, probably. Yes. In the Twitter sphere.
So if somebody is interested in learning more about your work, where can they find you apart from Twitter?
Well, we can share the there's a web page on the Liverpool University site in the Department of English, and I can share the link for that. That's fine. That has research interests, publications, that kind of thing. That's probably the simplest thing to have a look at. Yeah.
And if they have questions about lexical chunks, they can come and harass you on Twitter.
Well, they're welcome to ask. I don't know about harassing me, but yeah, I don't think anybody, well, I think they're very foolish to claim to have all of the answers to any of these things, but sure. Yeah, obviously that's the point of research, isn't it? To try to get further towards an answer. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.